Welcome to Nalthis, a world of power, color, and vibrant life. Here, everyone is born with a chunk of investiture called breath, and they can use this power to bring inanimate objects to life using something called awakening. At its most basic, awakening is the process of taking investiture and giving it to an inanimate object to bring it to life. It's a seemingly complicated magic system that involves things like intent, command, visualization, and many other Cosmere-wide principles. But as I look into it and study it more, I am starting to realize that awakening isn't actually that unique of a magic system. It seems to be a conglomerate of a bunch of different Cosmere-wide principles. It's gotten to the point that I don't think awakening is actually its own magic system. It's an amalgamation of many different Cosmere principles thrown together and codified.
This video will be sourcing information primarily from Warbreaker. However, I will also be pulling information from Yubi and the Nightmare Painter, Elantris, The Rhythm of War, Wind and Truth, Arcanum Unbounded, The Sunlit Man, Tress of the Emerald Sea, and The Lost Metal.
I'll try to avoid story spoilers where I can, but where I can't, I will provide a timestamp for where to skip to.
Awakening is best known from the planet Nalthis. Here, everyone is born with an extra chunk of investiture called a breath. This breath can be kept, transferred to another person, stored in an object, or used in awakening an object.
Awakening is the process of bringing inanimate objects to life, using investiture, typically breath. The awakened object is able to follow simple commands and use rudimentary problem solving to interpret the intent of its command and how to execute it. I'll have a whole section about how awakening works a little further on in this video, but before that, I think it's important that we have an understanding of what breath is and how it works. As I mentioned before, everyone here on Nalthis is born with a breath, and each one is roughly equal in strength. Everyone has the ability to pass breath from themselves to another person or from themselves to an object with the command, "My life to yours, my breath become yours."
Breath is basically the gaseous form of Endowment's investiture, and behaves similarly to Stormlight, the gaseous form of Honor's investiture. The biggest difference, aside from what shard the investiture is keyed to, is that breath is sticky, so it won't leave a person without them using it or them giving it away.
Different cultures on Nalthis have very different relationships with awakening. I'm actually leaving a village in Idris, returning to Hallandren so I can get off world, and their relationship with awakening, and especially returned, is very different from other places on the planet, which anyone who's read Warbreaker can tell you.
Breath doesn't dissipate in the same way that the lights on Roshar do. It doesn't stream off the body as it escapes through the pores. Breath is content to stay inside a person or an object until it's called upon or moved. This is, in my opinion, likely due to Endowment's intent, the shard of gifts and birthright. A single breath is enough to make the general population of Nalthis more resistant to minor diseases, and if people are in dire need, they can sell their breath for a substantial amount of money. Breath also makes the world seem brighter, sensations sweeter, and colors deeper.
If someone were to give away their breath, leaving them with nothing, they become something called a drab. These are people who don't have that extra chunk of investiture and are even less invested than most normal people in the Cosmere. Being a drab also makes colors less vibrant and life just less sweet. Sensations are duller. People who are drabs are also more prone to getting disease as well as melancholy and depression. In Warbreaker, it's stated by Denth that being a drab doesn't really change your life and psychology, but this apparently was a lie.
Vivenna's thoughts on being a drab. A lot of what happened to Vivenna, how she saw the world and how she acted, was influenced by being a drab. As I've said before, the Hallandren aren't right when they say losing your breath does nothing to you. Most drabs struggle with depression, and the fact that they're almost always sick doesn't help either. And so, Vivenna's time on the streets was artificially made more dreary and terrible than it truly was. Being a drab, being sick, the shock of being betrayed, these things combine to give you the person you saw in the 2 previous chapters. It's a way to cut a corner. I wanted Vivenna to feel like she'd been on the streets for months, but for it to only have been a few weeks. She's able to make her hair change colors again. This is a representation of the fact that she has started to pull out of the nightmare. She's slightly in control of her world again, and the roughest time for her is past. There's also a clue in that hair, one that Vasher mentions. Because of it and her heritage and something very mysterious in the past, every member of the royal line has a fraction of a divine returned breath in them. That makes it much easier for them to learn to awaken than a normal person. It's also important to note that a normal person in the Cosmere is more invested than a drab. Giving away all a person's breath on Nalthis leaves them with duller perceptions than people from other planets in the Cosmere.
Conversely, it is possible for people to buy more breaths, giving themselves more power and reaching greater heightenings. However, it is important to know that passing breath or giving it to someone else has to be voluntary. It can't just be stolen. But if someone were to figure out a command to just, take breath, I assume it would be a rather breathtaking command.
Having breath and utilizing breath are two very different and distinct states of use. It's a difference between static or stored investiture and kinetic or utilized investiture. Holding breath gives a person an increased life sense, ability to perceive the world around you, as well as makes a person more resistant to diseases.
As a fun side effect of everyone on Nalthis being more invested, they don't really have to worry about disease as much. Everyone's immune systems are heightened due to the higher levels of investiture they have. As a fun little consequence of this, Nalthian customs for off-worlders, like the fact that they could bring in disease doesn't even cross their mind. Having more breaths gives the holder access to more abilities, and these are called Heightenings. The Ars Arcaeum in Warbreaker has a nifty little chart that breaks down how many breaths it takes to get to each heightening and what these abilities are. There are 10 known Heightenings, and here's what they do.
The first heightening requires 50 breaths and gives the person aura recognition. Aside from being able to tell when people in online game lobbies are farming aura, this heightening grants the ability to see the auras of other people holding breath and allows them to estimate how many breaths they hold. It also increases a person's life sense or the ability to sense those around them, especially if they're invested. The second heightening takes 200 breaths and grants perfect pitch. This grants the holder the ability to identify pitches and tones with greater accuracy and identify how far something is from the ideal or perfect pitch. The third heightening takes 600 breaths and gives perfect color recognition. Like those crazy people who are able to name and identify every color of every Lego brick, perfect color recognition allows for greater perception of the differences between color and how close those hues are to the perfect version of that color. I'll be talking more about what this means a little later on in the video. The fourth heightening requires 1,000 breaths and grants perfect life sense. A perfect life sense allows the holder to feel the presence of plants around them, as well as a better understanding of the distance of individuals around them. This sense can be blocked by AVR and copper clouds, as well as aluminum. This heightening also allows people to sense invested entities that are invisible, such as Spren.
The fifth heightening grants agelessness, which is unlocked at 2,000 breaths. While holding any amount of biochroma, or investiture that matter, makes someone more resistant to disease, at this heightening you unlock agelessness, which means you don't age. Wow, imagine that. To be clear, it doesn't grant invulnerability, just functional immortality. You can still be killed at the fifth heightening. As a world hopper myself, the fifth heightening is of particular interest.
The sixth heightening takes 3,500 breaths and grants instinctive awakening. This gives the holder an intuitive knowledge of how awakening works and how they can more easily identify what commands will work when awakening an object. We're now getting into the less understood heightenings. Due to the rarity of individuals who have acquired this many breaths, the abilities granted by these last few heightenings aren't well known or understood. The seventh heightening is achieved at 5,000 breaths and grants something called invested breath recognition. This allows one to identify the biochromatic aura of an awakened object as well as the auras of non-awakened objects. The eighth heightening is reached with 10,000 breaths, and it allows for instinctive command breaking, making it so you can break a previous awakener's command to an object, but not without significant effort. This is possible at lower heightenings, but it's more complex and difficult. The ninth heightening unlocks greater awakening and audible commands. This can be done after 20,000 breaths are obtained. Greater awakening refers to the ability to awaken objects that aren't organic, things like stone and steel, basically things that have never been alive. An audible command is the ability to awaken an object without touching it. The object just needs to be in range of the awakener's voice to be awakened. The 10th heightening is reached when someone gets 50,000 breaths. At this level, their biochromatic aura breaks apart light into its component colors, creating a rainbow aura around them. It also grants perfect invocation, the ability to drain the color of an object to white instead of gray when awakening. The final known ability at this heightening is the ability to awaken without a spoken command.
This is the frontier of awakening research for now, because the only people who have ever reached this heightening to our knowledge are the god kings of Hallandren. Despite many of these powers having a clear application to awakening, it doesn't seem to be unique to breath or biochroma. It seems to be more a side effect of holding a sticky form of investiture like a Dawn Shard, as we see in the book Dawn Shard. For them, colors became more vibrant, and it seemed like they reached the 5th heightening. In Warbreaker, Vasher provides some examples of what it takes for awakening to work, as well as a breakdown of different types of biochromatic entities. And real quick, what I love about this is that Vasher's a scientist. He recognizes that he's working with incomplete information and trying to fill it in as he goes, which is so good. He's working from the known to the unknown, and so when he gets more information, he has to amend his classification of biochromatic entities. And a fantastic example of this is the changes that he had to make after visiting Roshar.
In Warbreaker, Vasher's categorization of living investiture is organized like this. Type 1 biochromatic entities, spontaneous sentient biochromatic manifestations in a deceased host. These are living, thinking, self-aware entities like returned and cognitive shadows in a physical body. Type 2 biochromatic entities, mindless manifestations in a deceased host. These are the remains of a person or animal brought back to life with awakening, creating what is known as a lifeless. While alive, they had a functioning brain, so they're able to receive more complicated commands, but they're not sentient. Basically, the biological hardware is there, so the investiture has to do less work to think. Type 3 biochromatic entities. This is your typical awakening. It's giving an inanimate object some breath and a command so they can perform a task. The great limitation here is that the awakened object needs to be made of organic material like cloth, wool, or wood, as well as receive a valid command. It also helps if this organic material is in the shape of a person due to the law of biochromatic parallelism, which I'll talk about in the next section. Type 4 biochromatic entities are awakened items that have never been alive. Think metal or stone. These things are the hardest to awaken because they're things that have never been alive. Presumably, it would be easier to awaken an object of steel or stone if it was in the shape of a person. There's actually a fun wob about awakening a body that's been soul cast into stone, and that it's pretty easy to awaken the thing since it was alive once. Would an awakener be able to awaken a corpse that was soul cast into stone more easily because it used to be living, thereby being able to create lifeless similar to Claude's phantoms without having bones in the framework? Yes, that would definitely work.
This was the system that Vasher and presumably the 5 scholars came up with, and it worked for him pretty well until he learned about Spren.
On Roshar, Vasher amended his system to include Spren, basically shifting everything down a level. Type 1s became Type 2s in the categorization and so on. He considers Spren Type 1 invested entities, a chunk of divinity that came alive on its own. This categorization is fascinating to me. Until recently, I hadn't really put together the potential significance of it. In an attempt to not derail this video even more than I already have, I'll wait to share my theory until after I finish talking about what awakeners need to bring an object to life.
Awakening seems deceptively simple. To bring an object to life, all you need is investiture, color, a verbal command, you have to be touching the thing you want to awaken, and you have to visualize the intent. However, every single one of those things I listed has an asterisk attached to it. For example, the verbal command has to be in the native language of the awakener, and not just any command will work. Commands have to be very specific and not too complicated, unless they can be. And as for touch, this can be overcome with the right heightening. At a certain level, you only have to be within earshot of an object for it to be awakened.
In awakening an object, when you give it the sort of command, go get the keys or something, how does that object perceive the world around it? It doesn't have standard human senses. How does it see? How does it touch?
The closest correlation you have to this is how Inquisitors see.
Okay, then following up on that, say someone with bronze who... a bronze misting, managed to somehow get access to breath and awaken. Would he then be able to tell that object, hey, I sense this allomancer over there, can you find it?
That is not outside the realm of possibility.
The breath passed to an object doesn't provide the power for the object to do work. We know this because if an awakener puts in, let's say, 5 breaths into an awakened construct, they can withdraw 5 breaths afterwards without any diminishment of power. So, where does this power come from? It might be from color. In Nalthian Awakening, it seems like color serves the same purpose as metal and allomancy. The power doesn't come from the metal, but it acts as a catalyst, a spark, as it were, to draw power from the spiritual realm to fuel that invested art. The same seems to be true in Nalthian Awakening, with the draining of the object of the color being the catalyst, allowing the object to move.
However, unlike allomancy, once the color's drained from the object, the awakening doesn't stop until the object is either destroyed or the breath is retrieved from it. There are some wobs that state after a while the breath stored in an object will fade back into the spiritual realm, but exactly how long that takes isn't clear. The color drained from an object is mostly a change to the physical properties of that object, although there is apparently some change that happens to the spiritual aspect of the object as well.
Yes, so on Nalthis in the Warbreaker universe, when the color is pulled out of something, is that a chemical change, or is that just a perception change?
It is actually a physical change, but the spirit of the thing is changing, and it's filtering through to the physical realm.
So if I do that on a carrot, I can create a bit of carrot. If I do that on a piece of metal, I can reduce it and recharge my battery that way?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, that would work. You are changing its spiritual nature.
Speaking of which, not all colors are treated the same. The vibrancy of the color also plays a role. So the more vibrant a color that's being drained, the more powerful the awakening is, or rather, the lower the cost in terms of breath. Drab colors as a fuel makes it harder to awaken an object. For this reason, something in Hallandren is really sought after. It is a flower called the Tears of Edgli. And these flowers are only found in the low-lying area that Hallandren is in. The flowers come in many colors, and the dyes that are made from them stick to any fabric. The dye is also a little invested because the flowers bring in investiture from the ground, because Endowment's perpendicularity is nearby.
So we said, we don't have a symbol for Nalthis. What do we want that to be? And I talked to Brandon, and we said, well, maybe a symbol of the tears of, how do you say it?
Edgli?
Edgli?
Yeah.
Okay, so the tears of Edgli. And so we talk about, okay, what are the tears of Edgli? What do we know that's canonical? What do you have in your head? And we kind of came up with a story about them, and then I just start drawing.
So if you don't know what these are, the tears of Egilde are flowers that they get a specific dye for that are briefly mentioned in the books. But they are where the shard pool is in Warbreaker. So it's actually pretty relevant, even though in the first book it doesn't actually pop up that much.
Yeah, I think it's mentioned that they use them for particular
But they
dyes.
are invested flowers, basically.
I'm actually taking some of these home with me, if Nalthian Customs will let me take them off-world, that is. Anyway, another way to make awakening more efficient is if the object you're trying to awaken is close to a human form. This is due to a couple of biochromatic laws. So let's say I give a command to this yellow sheet. I'm not actually going to awaken this one, but let's say that I use upon call, be as my hands, and grab things. That would take, let's say, roughly 50 breaths to awaken this yellow cloth. Now, that's just a square, but if I have the same fabric and I cut it into roughly the same size, but in the shape of a person, this would be much easier to awaken, cost way fewer breaths. That's why Vasher's cloak in Warbreaker is actually, just like a large cutout of him wrapped around him. So if I were to say, upon call, be as my fingers and grab things, it would take, let's say, 25 breaths to awaken instead of the 50 of the square. These two fabrics are the same material. They're roughly the same amount of fabric, but this one costs vastly fewer breaths to awaken, just because of the shape it's in.
One of Awakening's two known named laws, the law of biochromatic parallelism, states that the closer a host is to a living shape and form, the easier it is to awaken. This means that objects made of organic material and shaped into an approximation of a living form take less breath to awaken. The other law, the law of biochromatic comparability, which states the amount of breath required to awaken something isn't necessarily indicative of its powers once awakened. This is like the example I gave with the two cloths. The two awakened objects might have the same command and perform the same function, but the amount of breaths needed to bring them to life would be drastically different. Another interesting thing I've thought about is what counts as something that used to be alive. In Awakening, it's far more common to awaken materials like cloth or hay or a corpse, something that remembers being alive. But what about something like plastic? Long ago it used to be alive. So would that be easier to awaken? We know that a body's soul cast to stone would be pretty easy to awaken because it used to be alive, so it just has to remember.
What if, hypothetically, someone were to take the blood from 255 people and extract all of the iron from that blood, maybe add some other metals to make it steel, and then forge that blood iron into a sword. And let's say, additionally, you took the breaths, or you forced them to give you the breaths before you killed them and drained them of their blood, and then used that breath to awaken the metal derived from their bodies. Would this be easier to awaken because the iron used to be alive not long ago, and the breaths that you're using to awaken it has a connection to that metal? I think it would, but I really, really never want anyone to try and find out.
Anyway, an awakener is able to take back the breaths they put in an object, getting the same amount out that they put in. Not just anyone can take the breaths from any awakened object, only the person who did the awakening can take those breaths back. This is also true of breaths simply stored in an object but not given a command. Those breaths are locked to the identity of the person who put them in there. This is extremely similar to ferrochemist metal mines. Generally, with exceptions, only the ferrochemist who stored an attribute in the metal mine can retrieve it. This is due to something called identity, a spiritual attribute related to one's sense of self. Certain invested arts are keyed to a person's identity, and breaths, while sticky and easily passed from person to person, are easily connected to the identity of the person holding them at the time. If someone without identity awakened an object, would anyone be able to recall the breath? Would they need to have any breath to recall it, or could it just be done by anyone at all? If you could blank identity plus awaken, yes, anyone could get it back. Requires intent.
Sanderson considers awakening an N-neutral magic system, which means, like feruchemy, you get the same amount of power out as you put in. In the case of feruchemy, you put in attributes into a metal mind, which you can extract later. Regardless of how fast or slowly you withdraw it, is the same amount. The same is true in awakening, where you get the same amount of breaths out of an awakening as you get in if you retrieve those breaths. Additionally, like feruchemy, that investiture is keyed and tied to the identity of the person who used it. For example, if a feruchemist has a steel mind, they're the only one who can withdraw that speed from that metal mind. With awakening, if you were to store your breaths in an object, only the person who stored those breaths in an object can retrieve them. And yeah, there are workarounds, like if someone were to blank their identity before doing any of this, it would create either an awakened object or a metal mind that anyone could withdraw from, but that's an edge case, okay? For example, let's take the command fetch keys, and let's imagine it takes 5 breaths to awaken something about this big. So you give that command to the object, it runs around looking for keys, it comes back, you take your breath from it, and you have 5 breath again. But as I mentioned earlier, that energy just seemingly came from nowhere, from the spiritual realm.
Theoretically, if given a simple command like spin, an awakened object would be able to do this indefinitely, at least until the breaths are retrieved or the top gets destroyed. This lines up with what we've heard via WoB about other societies on Nalthis, societies that have industrialized around the use of breath.
This infinite energy glitch has some interesting applications. Imagine a gear that is given the command to spin. It would just spin and spin and spin until the gear itself is degraded. But all you need is one gear for like an entire mechanism to work. Or what about a lifeless? Imagine you have a lifeless that's given the command to like spin a turbine to generate power. That lifeless will never get tired, and as long as it has Ichor alcohol in maintenance, it could just go indefinitely. Or an assembly line, assembling munitions, and you give a very simple command to one lifeless to do one thing. You would have a very, very efficient assembly line, and I can feel the Gilded Age capitalists of yesteryear rolling in their graves at the potential of this.
What gives me pause at the potential of this perpetual motion glitch is the Father Machine. It's seemingly needed to harvest more and more investiture to continue its operations and repair itself, so there's gotta be a limit somewhere. The machine wears down and presumably would cease to operate if it weren't able to maintain itself with more investiture simply due to wear and tear.
Use of awakened technology is spreading throughout the Cosmere, and it will probably become even more prominent as the Cosmere progresses.
The ability to basically give inanimate objects processing power has opened up a whole new tech tree in the future of the Cosmere. We've seen awakening and awakened technology on at least 5 different planets: Lumar, Komashi, Roshar, Nalthis, and Scadrial.
I'll briefly go over all the examples of awakening we've seen in the Cosmere so far, and as such, this section's gonna have slight spoilers for Tress of the Emerald Sea, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, the Lost Metal, and the Rhythm of War. So if you don't want those spoilers, I would say skip to this timestamp right here.
On Lumar, we see 3 examples of awakening or awakened technology: We see laptops and tablets that are said to be powered by awakened circuits. This is explicitly called out as Nalthian tech by Hoyd in the book. The awakened circuits in Fort's tablet appear to power the device's predictive text features. We also see awakened soldiers on the Sorceress's Island. These soldiers are known to be awakened constructs and impervious to most forms of attack available to the population of Lumar. We also see what seems to be awakening performed by Xisis the dragon. At a wave of his hand, the curtains in his chamber seem to come to life and form hands. This description is very similar to that we've seen of other awakened fabrics. What's interesting here is that Foyle didn't seem to use a vocal command to awaken the fabric, which could mean he has enough breath or investiture to be of the 9th Heightening. However, there wasn't a description of any colors being drained, so either Tress didn't notice, Hoyd telling the story neglected those details, or what Xisis did was similar to Nalthian Awakening, but not quite the same thing. Moving on to Komashi. The Father Machine is described by Hoyd to be an awakened device. Whether or not this is specifically Nalthian style awakening is not clear. We do know that it requires Hion or a spirit to get going, and it has received a specific command from those who created it. The exact wording of this command is unknown. Next up, Roshar. Nothing too special here. In the Rhythm of War, we see Vasher use Awakening in a duel with Kaladin. The cloth grabs Cal and the color is drained from some fabric. And finally, some spicy stuff. It's a very brief mention, but the Ghostbloods utilize awakened locks in the Lost Metal. There are a couple of fascinating things about these locks, one of which gets explicitly called out in text.
These locks are allegedly able to detect someone's intentions. Not capital I intent, but intentions. For example, if someone were to steal or coercively obtain the password necessary to unlock that lock, it wouldn't open because it detects that there's foul play in their intentions. I also say allegedly because we've never actually seen someone fail at opening an awakened lock, and that seems very in character for Kelsier to just be like, yes, this lock knows when you're lying, don't double cross me or it'll know. So alleged until we see it fail. Also, a bigger deal to me is that the lock is awakened metal, and we know that only someone of the 9th Heightening has access to awakening metal, and it takes a lot of breath to bring metal to life. And it's casual, it's mundane, but that's the part that is fascinating to me. Although it's not entirely clear if this is Nalthian Awakening that we're dealing with this lock, so that limitation might not apply. And finally, with all that explanation out of the way, I can get to my theory. Awakening isn't actually a magic system. Okay, I know how crazy that sounds. I just spent the last who knows how long talking about Awakening and everything involved with it, and it seems like a magic system, but let me explain. Awakening does have rules: intent, command, focus, etc. But this isn't unique to Awakening. Awakening, in my estimation, is just a bunch of Cosmere principles shoved in a box and tied together with a very colorful ribbon.
Let's break down Awakening into its individual elements. The equation, as it were, to awaken an object is as follows, simplified a bit from earlier. Command plus intent plus investiture plus color plus an object equals a living object capable of thinking, at least enough to interpret the intent of its command. When an Awakener uses breath, they think of it as if they're bringing an inanimate object to life, but I don't think this is actually the right way to look at things. As we've seen many times in the Cosmere, all investiture wants to be alive. We've seen many examples of this in the Cosmere, especially recently. The planet Cell, the Evelon Threnody, Spren, Sion, Skaze, the Hijo, the Shard of Honor, and others are all chunks of power that have begun thinking and developing into their own thing, taking on human attributes and in some cases adopting the shape of a person. And this fits in line well with one of the named laws of Awakening. The laws of biochromatic parallelism states that the closer a host is to living shape and form, the easier it is to awaken. Biochroma is the power of life, and so it seeks patterns of life.
Awakening is just a smaller scale version of what all investiture wants to do: be alive. Does this mean that all naturally occurring chunks of living investiture follow a command? Of that, I'm not sure, but in intent, absolutely they do.
Every chunk of living investiture we've seen, with a couple of exceptions, appears to be attempting to follow the intent of the shard that it's keyed to. The personality of the Shard of Honor clearly wants to be honorable and keep oaths. The Sions are loyal and loving by nature, while the Skaze long for greater power. Hijo are attracted to art and creation. We even have this fascinating quote from Vasher in Rhythm of War. The longer one of us exists, the more like a spren we become, consumed by singular purpose, our minds bound and chained by our intent.
The command portion I'm less sure of, but it might have something to do with Adonalsium's 4 aspects, or maybe even the Dawn Shards, the 4 primal commands used to create all things. But intent? Absolutely they do. Wow, look, a continuity error. So in the time between writing this video, shooting it, and editing it, Isles of the Emberdark came out, and added a couple things about living Investiture that I need to address. If you don't want spoilers for that book, skip to this timestamp right here. We learn a lot in the Isles of the Emberdark, but relevant to this video, we learn about the evil as well as how perceptions impact invested entities. We also learn a little bit more about how invested entities are categorized in the future of the Cosmere. They still seem to be separated into like type 1, type 2, type 3, etc. And invested entities made purely of investiture are still type 1s, just with like a dash and a number to denote like the subtype of them. But what I really need to bring up is something about intents that we learn. In the book, we learn more about the evil and what these chunks of ambition, these splinters, actually are. And what's fascinating is we learn that whatever Odium did to kill ambition removed part of the intent of the Shard of Ambition from these chunks of investiture. It stripped away their intent, which is very strange. The Clash also created a bunch of anti-investiture, or negative investiture as they sometimes call it. They use it interchangeably, which I think is weird, but that's neither here nor there. So basically, the evil are negative investiture chunks of ambition's investiture with the intent stripped from it, that just seeks to destroy all life and specifically highly invested entities. They also seem to have breached containment from Threnody, which is terrifying. But yeah, just a little bit of implication confirmation that Type 1 invested entities do tend to follow the intent of the shards that they're associated with, but if it's removed, there are disastrous consequences. Anyway, back to the video. Awakening is just a localized version of this concept, but instead of following a shard's intent, they're following the intent and the command of the awakener that brings them to life. They're essentially making a micro-cognitive shadow with a very specific purpose. The breath actually appears to make an incomplete copy of somebody's cognitive aspect, at least in regards to this command and the interpretation thereof.
Do breaths inherently possess the ability to interpret and carry out commands, or does the awakener need to impart that decision-making ability on the awakened object? If the awakener does need to impart the decision-making ability, then does the awakening consist of an awakener copying a portion of his or her cognitive aspect, as determined by his or her visualization and verbal command, onto the cognitive aspect of that object being awakened, with breath then providing the juice for the object to actually follow its command, powering both physical motion and cognition based upon the copied cognitive aspect? If so, is that copying what drains the color? You're very close here.
So after all that, what is Awakening really? It's not just a colorful magic system tucked away on Nalthis, it's a distilled and deliberate echo of how the Cosmere works, and of how Investiture behaves when it's left on its own. Awakening seems to be a process that mimics what's happening naturally across the Cosmere. Investiture looking for an intent and a form. Where most magic systems in the Cosmere lean into the shard's intent, Awakening is different. Due to Endowment's intent of giving things freely in gifts, it's about allowing the Awakener to imbue an object with their intent and their command. They're impressing their intent and commands directly onto the Investiture itself. Every awakened object is a tiny obedient spren, a living command. It's not giving something life so much as it is offering Investiture a vessel. But again, Investiture wants to be alive. We've seen this many times in the Cosmere. Spren, Siones, Hijo, the Evil, I still don't know what's going on with that one, and even full shards like Honor have shown us this time and time again, that Investiture seeks form and seeks to be alive. Given enough time and circumstances, power starts thinking in the Cosmere. Awakening is just the most human and localized version of this phenomenon. It's a way to cheat Investiture into thinking, into personhood. So maybe what's special about Awakening isn't the magic system itself, but it is the ability that it grants Awakeners to play Shard for a little bit, to imbue an object with their intent and command. We give the command, and the breath listens. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe and share it with all your friends who enjoy the Cosmere. And if you want to see more content like this, please consider becoming a channel member or a patron. And special thanks to Dennis for supporting the channel. But that's all I've got for you now. Thank you so much for watching. Have an excellent time of day, and I'll catch you all next time. Okay guys, bye.